President Trump could be reviving a controversial policy from his first term, the Muslim ban. On day one of his second term, Trump signed an executive order titled Protecting the United States from Foreign Terrorists and Other National Security and Public Safety Threats. According to legal scholar Maryam Jamshidi, not only does it mirror the first Trump ban on Muslims, but this one is worse.
This new order not only lays the groundwork for a Muslim ban to be reinstated, but it offers an even wider scope through which to deny visas to people if they, quote, bear hostile attitudes toward its citizens, culture, government, institutions, or founding principles. And it removes individuals who have already entered the country. Here to discuss this renewed effort is Maryam Jamshidi, a resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Welcome to Rising.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I guess to start with, there are probably a number of people, perhaps they're watching, who would say, well, why shouldn't we, the government, take action to make sure people who are hostile to the American citizens or its institutions not enter the country in the first place, or not be here at all? I think that's something some people would say we ought to be doing.
Well, I mean, if we think back to the inspiration for this ban, which was the first, second, third, and fourth iterations of the Muslim ban under the first Trump administration. I mean, we know it was quite clear that the motivation there was discriminatory. Trump made that very clear. Legal experts were clear about that as well. The American public saw the Muslim ban as quite discriminatory, so much so that one of the first actions of the Biden administration upon coming to office was to cancel the Muslim ban. So on the one hand, this act currently, this executive order that was just issued by the second Trump administration, relies on a policy that was widely understood to be discriminatory. And then it takes that further by creating certain orders that encourage the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies to also think about exclusion or removal based on ideological positions. And again, these ideological positions are not well defined at all under the order, quite subject to manipulation as a result, and can be used, frankly, by the Trump administration to exclude individuals that the Trump administration doesn't like because it disagrees with their political viewpoints. Again, in my view, an illegitimate basis for removing, excluding, or refusing to allow individuals into this country.
And you believe that at least as a matter of practicality, whatever about the actual terminology used in the executive order, as a practical matter, you believe that is far more likely to target or to exclude Muslims than people who might have I don't know, subversive or otherwise radical beliefs who are non-Muslims?
Well, again, there are various provisions in this order. There are the provisions which are under Section 2 that are specifically mimicking the Muslim ban. So that section asks the Secretary of State, the Secretary of DHS, and other government officials to report to the president in 60 days with a list of countries whose nationals should be partially or totally excluded from the United States. That, I think, will likely impact at least some of the same countries that we saw under the Muslim ban as implemented by the first Trump administration. I certainly think Iran will be a part of that list. There are other provisions, though, of this executive order. Under Section C, we see the language around excluding or removing individuals who hold ideologies or engage in behaviors that threaten the constitutional rights of Americans, call for, I believe, something like sectarian violence, or promote, support, or aid, quote unquote, foreign terrorist groups, which is not actually defined under this order. That may not necessarily only impact Muslims. That provision, again, I believe is widely understood. I certainly understand it as specifically targeting foreign nationals, most likely foreign students in particular, who are involved in pro-Palestine advocacy in this country.
Well, again, though, I mean, the way you just... Go ahead.
And I was just going to say, and the reason I think that is because over the last year and a half, since protests have really taken off at college campuses across this country, there have been calls by various private and public officials, including the current Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, to deport foreign students who participate in pro-Palestine protests.
Well, you say pro-Palestine protests. I mean, some of these protests were not just pro-Palestinian in character, but were actually in support of terrorist actions undertaken by Hamas. So I think the standpoint of some of the people you're referring to is that if you're, now you have First Amendment rights if you're an American citizen, surely I would not take action or do anything about students or anyone else who's here espousing pro-Hamas views, but if the First Amendment doesn't apply to you because you're here illegally, then the argument is that, well, if you're going to espouse pro-terrorist talking points, you're going to be given the boot for doing that. That is, there is a tremendous desire to do that among many conservatives, certainly.
Well, first of all, the First Amendment applies to anyone that's here. Second of all, I very strongly disagree with your statement about these protests being pro-terrorism. I think that is, in fact, very much a anti-Palestinian, pro-Israel talking point that massively misrepresents and distorts what these protests, particularly on campuses, are calling for. They're calling for the liberation of the Palestinian people. They're calling for freedom. They're calling for the end of apartheid. They're calling for the end of genocide. And they're calling on their universities to stop supporting those actions through various forms of investment. This notion that those protests are somehow advocating for or supporting terrorism are, again, distortions, inflammatory distortions, and frankly, racist and bigoted distortions that aim to delegitimize the valid requests and demands of these students and protesters. Might there be some individuals who engage in inappropriate action or inappropriate statements? Of course. That happens all the time in all sorts of protest movements. But to suggest that the predominant message of this protest movement is a support for terrorism is frankly unbelievable and unsupported by the facts.
Students for Justice in Palestine, the largest activist group organizing on campuses on their behalf, celebrated the events of October 7th as a historic win for the liberation of the Palestinian people. That's not a few fringe group. That's in the materials published by the group itself. Is it not expressing some level of sympathy for terrorist actions to say that what happened on October 7th was good and we want more of it?
National Students for Justice of Palestine is the umbrella organization, so it's its own independent organization. There are hundreds of chapter organizations across U.S. campuses. To impute or to impugn what National Students for Justice in Palestine say to all of their chapters is, again, without more factual evidence, I think unfair and unsupported. Now, what National Students for Justice in Palestine said, they are entitled to say, under the First Amendment, you can, call it or characterize it however you want.
Well, I'm just saying you characterize it as not support for terrorism. I'm reading from the document. We witnessed a historic win for the Palestinian resistance. That's referring to the events of October 7th.
Unfair and unsupported. And it's more than just National Students for Justice in Palestine involved. Jewish Voices for Peace, all sorts of other organizations unaffiliated with National Students for Justice in Palestine are also involved in the protest movement.
All right, Trump has won, and we don't have to countenance support for terrorism anymore. But Niall, do you have?
Nor are we.
Well, as you may know, Maryam, we have a diversity of viewpoints here, and so I am broadly sympathetic to the view that the charge of backing terrorism has been weaponized to slur pro-Palestinian protests or people who were rightfully, in my view, outraged by the killing of more than 40,000 people and the United States backing for that killing. Having said that, I mean, I think that Robbie was making a point about specific instances which I would not defend, where people were endorsing the events of October 7th. That to this point, in a way, I think getting back to the executive order, one of your concerns about this is the breadth of the language. And I'm looking at the executive order here, and it talks about protecting America from people who, and I quote, espouse hateful ideology, or later bear hostile attitudes toward America's citizens, culture, government, or institutions. That seems to me a very, very broad net that could be defined by a government in almost any way it wishes.
Absolutely. This is, that charge is incredibly broad, very subject to interpretation and manipulation. If people are concerned about the Trump administration and its political ideology, I would be similarly concerned about political litmus tests that that administration decides to set out, whether they are for foreign nationals or anyone else. And again, this order doesn't just apply to people who are not currently in the country, who do not enjoy the protections of the Constitution. It would also apply to people who are in this country. And, it's hard to say what would happen given the current makeup of the Supreme Court, but, it would seem that at least the way the charge this order has created for the executive branch potentially leads us down the road where individuals, at least foreign nationals in this country who become swept up in this language, could potentially bring First Amendment claims, obviously depending upon the circumstances, in order to defeat an effort to have them removed because of their quote unquote political ideology, whatever that might be.
Maryam Jamshidi of the Quincy Institute, thanks for joining us. Spirited discussion. Come back soon.
Thank you so much. Take care.